It is a vital necessity that this should be so. If, therefore, the ego falls for any length of time under the control of an unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed and the way opened for all sorts of possible accidents. Hence, it is of the greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc., are of great value on the moral side, just as accurate observation of the symptomatology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. However, accentuation of the ego personality and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized, and the self consequently becomes assimilated to the ego. Although this is the exact opposite of the process we have just described, it is followed by the same result: inflation. The world of consciousness must now be levelled down in favour of the reality of the unconscious. In the first case, reality had to be protected against an archaic, eternal and ubiquitous dream state. In the second, room must be made for the dream at the expense of the world of consciousness. In the first case, mobilization of all the virtues is indicated. In the second, the presumption of the ego can only be damped down by moral defeat. This is necessary, because otherwise one will never attain that median degree of modesty which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. For instance, a man who is not conscientious enough has to make a moral effort in order to come up to the mark, while for one who is sufficiently rooted in the world through his own efforts, it is no small moral achievement to inflict defeat on his virtues by loosening his ties with the world and reducing his adaptive performance. One thinks in this connection of Brother Klaus, now canonized, who, for the salvation of his soul, left his wife to her own devices, along with numerous progeny. Since real moral problems all begin where the penal code leaves off, their solution can seldom or never depend on precedent, much less on precepts and commandments. The real moral problems spring from conflicts of duty. Anyone who is sufficiently humble or easygoing can always reach a decision with the help of some outside authority, but one who trusts others as little as himself can never reach a decision at all, unless it is brought about in the manner which common law calls an act of God. The Oxford Dictionary defines this concept as the action of uncontrollable natural forces. In all such cases there is an unconscious authority which puts an end to doubt by creating a fait accompli. In the last analysis, this is true also of those who get their decision from a higher authority, only in more veiled form. One can describe this authority either as the will of God or as an action of uncontrollable natural forces, though psychologically it makes a good deal of difference how one thinks of it. The rationalistic interpretation of this inner authority as natural forces, or the instincts, satisfies the modern intellect, but has the great disadvantage that the apparent victory of instinct offends our moral self-esteem. Hence we like to persuade ourselves that the matter has been decided solely by the rational motions of the will. Civilized man has such a fear of the crimen lesae majestatis humanae, the crime of high treason, that whenever possible he indulges in a retrospective coloration of the facts in order to cover up the feeling of having suffered a moral defeat. He prides himself on what he believes to be his self-control and the omnipotence of his will, and despises the man who lets himself be outwitted by mere nature. If, on the other hand, the inner authority is conceived as the will of God, which implies that natural forces are divine forces, our self-esteem is benefited because the decision then appears to be an act of obedience, and the result a divine intention. This way of looking at it can, with some show of justice, be accused not only of being very convenient, but of cloaking moral laxity in the mantle of virtue. The accusation, however, is justified only when one is, in fact, knowingly hiding one's own egoistic opinion behind a hypocritical facade of words. But this is by no means the rule, for in most cases instinctive tendencies assert themselves for or against one's subjective interests, no matter whether an outside authority approves or not. The inner authority does not need to be consulted first, as it is present at the outset in the intensity of the tendencies struggling for decision. In this struggle, the individual is never a spectator only. He takes part in it more or less voluntarily, and tries to throw the weight of his feelings of moral freedom into the scales of decision. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of doubt how much his seemingly free decision has a causal and possibly unconscious motivation. This may be quite as much an act of God as any natural cataclysm. The problem seems to me unanswerable because we do not know where the roots of the feeling of moral freedom lie, and yet they exist no less surely than the instincts which are felt as compelling forces. All in all, it is not only more beneficial, but more correct, psychologically, to explain as the will of God the natural forces that appear in us as instincts. In this way, we find ourselves living in harmony with the habitus of our ancestral psychic life. That is, we function as man has functioned at all times and in all places. The existence of this habitus is proof of its viability, for if it were not viable, all those who obeyed it would long since have perished of maladaptation. On the other hand, by conforming to it, one has a reasonable life expectancy. When an habitual way of thinking guarantees as much as this, there is not only no ground for declaring it incorrect, but on the contrary, every reason to take it as true or correct in the psychological sense. Psychological truths are not metaphysical insights. They are habitual modes of thinking, feeling, and behaving which experience has proved appropriate and useful. So, when I say that the impulses which we find in ourselves should be understood as the will of God, I wish to emphasize that they ought not to be regarded as an arbitrary wishing and willing, but as absolutes which one must learn how to handle correctly. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature, and what is suppressed comes up again in another place in altered form, but this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. I should also like the term God, in the phrase the will of God, to be understood not so much in the Christian sense as in the sense intended by Diotima when she said, Eros, dear Socrates, is a mighty demon. The Greek words daimon and daimonion express a determining power which comes upon man from outside, like providence or fate, though the ethical decision is left to man. He must know, however, what he is deciding about and what he is doing. Then, if he obeys, he is following not just his own opinion, and if he rejects, he is destroying not just his own invention. The purely biological or scientific standpoint falls short in psychology because it is, in the main, intellectual only. That this should be so is not a disadvantage, since the methods of natural science have proved of great heuristic value in psychological research. But the psychic phenomenon cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value, and this depends on the intensity of the accompanying feeling tones. Hence, at least the two rational functions are needed in order to map out anything like a complete diagram of a given psychic content. If, therefore, in dealing with psychic contents, one makes allowance not only for intellectual judgments, but for value judgments as well, not only is the result a more complete picture of the content in question, but one also gets a better idea of the particular position it holds in the hierarchy of psychic contents in general. The feeling value is a very important criterion, which psychology cannot do without, because it determines, in large measure, the role which the content will play in the psychic economy. That is to say, the affective value gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity, in its turn, expresses that idea's energetic tension, its affective potential. The shadow, for instance, usually has a decidedly negative feeling value, while the anima, like the animus, has more of a positive one. Whereas the shadow is accompanied by more or less definite and describable feeling tones, the anima and animus exhibit feeling qualities that are harder to define. Mostly they are felt to be fascinating or numinous. Often they are surrounded by an atmosphere of sensitivity, touchy reserve, secretiveness, painful intimacy, and even absoluteness. The relative autonomy of the anima and animus figures expresses itself in these qualities. In order of affective rank, they stand to the shadow very much as the shadow stands in relation to ego consciousness. The main affective emphasis seems to lie on the latter. At any rate, it is able, by means of a considerable expenditure of energy, to repress the shadow, at least temporarily. But if, for any reason, the unconscious gains the upper hand, then the valency of the shadow and of the other figures increases proportionately, so that the scale of values is reversed. What lay furthest away from waking consciousness and seemed unconscious assumes, as it were, a threatening shape, and the affective value increases the higher up the scale you go: ego consciousness, shadow, anima, self. This reversal of the conscious waking state occurs regularly during the transition from waking to sleeping, and what then emerge most vividly are the very things that were unconscious by day. Every abaissement du niveau mental brings about a relative reversal of values. I am speaking here of the subjective feeling value, which is subject to the more or less periodic changes described above. But there are also objective values, which are founded on a consensus omnium, moral, aesthetic, and religious values, for instance, and these are universally recognized ideals or feeling tone, collective ideas. Lévi-Bruhl's représentation collective. These subjective feeling tones, or value quanta, are easily recognized by the kind and number of constellations or symptoms of disturbance they produce. Collective ideals often have no subjective feeling tone, but nevertheless retain their feeling value. This value, therefore, cannot be demonstrated by subjective symptoms, though it may be by the attributes attaching to these collective ideas and by their characteristic symbolism, quite apart from their suggestive effect. The problem has a practical aspect, since it may easily happen that a collective idea, though significant in itself, is, because of its lack of subjective feeling tone, represented in a dream only by a subsidiary attribute, as when a god is represented by his theriomorphic attribute, etc. Conversely, the idea may appear in consciousness lacking the affective emphasis that properly belongs to it, and must then be transposed back into its archetypal context, a task that is usually discharged by poets and prophets. Thus, Hölderlin, in his Hymn to Liberty, lets this concept, worn stale by frequent use and misuse, rise up again in its pristine splendour. Since her arm out of the dust has raised me, beats my heart so boldly and serene, and my cheek still tingles with her kisses, flushed and glowing where her lips have been. Every word she utters by her magic rises new created without flaw. Hearken to the tidings of my goddess. Hearken to the sovereign, and adore.